Imagine a world where your potential is decided not by your talent or your drive, but by the very fact of your birth. A world where half the population faces invisible walls around their dreams, their ambitions, their very ability to earn a living. What if we told you this wasn't some dystopian fantasy, but a stark reality for millions, just over 1,000 years ago? What if we told you that in 680 the limitations placed on women's economic agency were so profound, they shaped entire societies and destinies? Number 10. Legal guardianship and the invisible chains of male authority. Imagine living in a world where your very existence as an adult woman was legally tied to a male guardian. Think about it. Every major economic decision, every step you took in the realm of property or commerce often needed the nod, the consent, the signature of a father, a brother, an uncle, or a husband. In the sprawling Byzantine Empire, whose laws were still heavily influenced by the grand Roman tradition, women, even if technically adults, often remained under the tutelage of a male relative. For many significant legal and economic acts, a woman could not simply walk into the marketplace and independently negotiate a large sale of goods or purchase a valuable piece of land without her guardian's approval. Her legal identity was often subsumed, much like a shadow following its object. If a woman inherited a substantial dowry, which was sometimes the case for wealthier families, that wealth was often administered by her husband. He controlled the capital, even if its ultimate ownership was technically hers. This was not always a malicious act. It was the deeply ingrained legal framework of the time, meant to protect women who were viewed as needing guidance in the complex world of commerce and law. Yet, this protection was a cage, a legal straitjacket that choked off economic independence before it could even sprout. Consider the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerging in what we now call England. Here, a woman's worth was often measured in her family connections and her husband's status. Though some early Anglo-Saxon legal codes hint at women having more rights than in later periods, the overarching societal structure still placed women under male authority. A woman would not typically appear in court to defend a complex land claim without her male kin representing her interests. If she wanted to sell a small plot of land she had somehow acquired, perhaps through a personal gift, the transaction would invariably involve her husband or another male relative validating the deal. It was not enough for her to simply declare her will. The law demanded a male voice to echo and legitimize her own. This guardianship extended beyond mere transactions. It influenced their ability to enter into contracts, to incur debt, or to initiate legal proceedings. While historical records sometimes show powerful abbesses or queenly figures exercising significant economic power, these were often exceptions. Women who operated within the confines of specific institutional structures, or through the direct power of their male lineage. For the vast majority of women, from the rural villages to the burgeoning towns, their economic wings were clipped by this pervasive legal guardianship, a system that essentially told them, you are not quite whole in the eyes of the law. The economic doors that opened for men, doors to negotiation, independent trade, and otter pill ventures, often remained firmly shut for women, locked by the invisible but unbreakable chains of male authority. Even in the nascent Islamic Caliphate. While early Islamic law offered women more rights in property ownership and inheritance than many contemporary systems, the concept of male guardianship, or qawwama, still meant that a woman's economic and legal actions often required the consent or oversight of her father or husband, especially in matters involving public transactions or travel for trade. This was not merely a social norm. It was often codified within the emerging legal frameworks, creating a universal limitation on a woman's ability to act as a truly independent economic agent. Number 9. Restricted property, ownership, and control. Imagine working your entire life, perhaps spinning wool, tending fields or managing a household, only to find that the land you toil on, the tools you use, and the fruits of your labor are not truly yours to control. In 680, and across vast stretches of the world, women faced immense restrictions on owning and controlling property, especially land, which was the primary source of wealth and power. Even if a woman technically owned land, her ability to manage it, sell it, or profit from it independently was severely curtailed, often by law, always by custom. In the feudalizing societies of Western Europe, land was power. It came with obligations, responsibilities, and the ability to command resources and people. Women rarely held direct title to large estates, especially if they were married. When a woman married, her property, even that which she brought into the marriage as a dowry, often fell under her husband's administration. He reaped the harvests, negotiated the leases, and made decisions about its use. She could not sell it without his permission, nor could she easily reclaim it should the marriage dissolve, unless specific and rare legal provisions were made. This was not just about control. It was about the very foundation of economic independence. A woman without land or control over her assets had little leverage, little bargaining power, and little ability to generate independent wealth. Consider the life of a peasant woman in Merovingian Gaul. Her days were spent in grueling agricultural labor, but the field she worked belonged to her husband's family or the local lord. The meager produce she helped cultivate was often for the household's survival, and any surplus that could be sold at market was managed by her husband. She might have her own small plot for herbs or a few chickens, but the foundational economic asset of the time, the land, was largely out of her independent reach. In the Byzantine Empire, while women from aristocratic families might possess significant wealth, including urban properties, or even rural estates, the management of these assets was almost universally overseen by male relatives. A wealthy Byzantine lady might technically own a grand villa in Constantinople, but her husband would be the one dealing with tenants, collecting rents, and negotiating repairs. She would enjoy the comfort and status the property afforded, but the active economic agency that came with its management was denied to her. She could not, for instance, decide to sell a part of her property to fund a new business venture without her husband's consent, and often his direct involvement. This wasn't just about preventing women from owning land. It was about preventing them from participating in the broader economic system that land ownership enabled. They could not leverage land for credit, they could not use it as collateral for loans, and they could not freely buy and sell to accumulate wealth. Even in regions where women had a semblance of property rights, these were often fragile and easily circumvented by custom or male authority. In some interpretations of early Islamic law, women had the right to own and manage their own property, including land and businesses separate from their husbands. However, societal norms and the pervasive concept of male guardianship often meant that this right was not fully realized in practice for many. A woman might technically own a small shop, but cultural expectations or male family members could still dictate how she ran it, or whether she ran it at all. The underlying message was clear. Direct independent control over significant economic assets was predominantly a male prerogative. This system ensured that economic power remained concentrated in the hands of men, making it incredibly difficult for women to break out of cycles of economic dependence and forge their own paths, regardless of their skills or aspirations. The very foundation of economic agency, the ability to own and control wealth-generating assets, was largely denied to women, leaving them in a perpetual state of economic vulnerability and reliance on male relatives. Number 8. Limited inheritance. Rights. Imagine your family's wealth built over generations being systematically diverted away from you simply because you were born a daughter. This was a common reality in 680. Inheritance laws, customs, and practices across most societies overwhelmingly favored male heirs, often leaving women with significant less, or in many cases, no direct inheritance of valuable assets, like land or significant family businesses. While a daughter might receive a dowry, this was often seen as her share of the inheritance, a one-time payment upon marriage, rather than a continuous right to family wealth. This practice effectively removed her from the direct line of inheritance for ancestral property, ensuring that the family's core assets remained in male hands. In Western Europe, particularly among the Germanic tribes that dominated much of the landscape, partible inheritance was sometimes practiced, meaning land could be divided among all sons. Daughters, however, were often excluded or received a much smaller portion, frequently in the form of movable goods or a dowry. If a family had no sons, the inheritance might pass to male relatives through collateral lines, such as brothers or nephews of the deceased, rather than directly to daughters. This was not merely about unfairness. It was about the concentration of power and wealth. Land was the basis of political and economic influence, and by ensuring it remained within male lineages, societies reinforced patriarchal structures for centuries to come. A woman might see her brothers inheriting sprawling estates while she received a few pieces of jewelry, or a modest sum, rendering her economically reliant on her husband or her brothers if she remained unmarried. Consider the aristocratic families in the Byzantine Empire. While daughters often received substantial dowries that could include properties, these properties were typically administered by the husband upon marriage. The dowry was meant to ensure the woman's sustenance and status within her new household, but it did not grant her independent economic control over the assets during the marriage. More importantly, ancestral land and titles generally passed through the male line. If a woman's father died, her brothers would inherit the family estates and positions, while she would primarily benefit from the dowry already provided, or from her husband's wealth. This meant that the accumulation of generational wealth and economic power remained largely within male control, preventing women from building their own independent economic bases through inheritance. Even in regions where emerging legal systems provided women with more explicit inheritance rights, societal norms often created barriers. Early Islamic law, for instance, stipulated that daughters inherit half the share of sons. While this was a significant advancement compared to many contemporary societies where women inherited nothing, it still reflected a hierarchy. Furthermore, the actual execution of these rights could be influenced by family pressure, social expectations, or a woman's inability to navigate complex legal processes without male assistance. A woman might legally be entitled to a share of her father's land, but the social expectation or pressure from her male relatives might lead her to defer its management to them, or even gift it back, thereby losing effective economic control. The long-term consequence of these limited inheritance rights was profound. It meant that women had fewer opportunities to accumulate capital, fewer opportunities to own income, generating assets, and fewer opportunities to pass on wealth to their own children independently. Their economic well-being was perpetually tied to the fortunes of their male relatives, ensuring a continuous cycle of economic dependency and hindering their ability to become self-sufficient economic actors. The rules of inheritance were not just about money. They were about power, legacy, and the fundamental right to control one's economic destiny. Number 7. Barriers to formal education and literacy. Imagine a world where books are rare, writing is a specialized skill, and the keys to knowledge are largely kept from half the population. In 680, the vast majority of people, both men and women, were illiterate. However, the existing and very limited educational opportunities that did exist were overwhelmingly directed towards men, effectively creating significant barriers for women to acquire literacy and formal learning. This wasn't just about reading stories. It was about access to information, legal documents, religious texts, and the broader intellectual currents that underpin economic advancement. Without literacy, a woman could not understand, contracts, manage complex accounts, write letters to facilitate trade, or even comprehend the legal rights she might theoretically possess. Across Western Europe, education was primarily the domain of monasteries, convents, or private tutors for the elite. For boys, particularly those destined for the clergy, nobility, or administration, literacy was a path to power and influence. They learned Latin, studied theology, law, and classical texts. For girls, formal education was far rarer, while some aristocratic girls might receive basic instruction in reading and writing. Often within convents, the curriculum was generally focused on religious piety, household management, and skills deemed appropriate for their station. The idea of educating a woman for a profession, for commerce, or for intellectual pursuits was largely alien. Peasant girl would learn what was necessary for survival and household duties from her mother and other women in the community. Her education was practical, not intellectual, and certainly not designed to foster economic independence beyond the domestic sphere. She would learn to spin, to cook, to tend to animals, to manage a garden, but not to read a ledger or write a deed. In the Byzantine Empire, a more sophisticated society with a strong emphasis on classical learning, literacy rates were higher than in the West, especially in urban centers like Constantinople. However, formal schooling was still predominantly for boys. Girls from wealthy families might be tutored at home, focusing on rhetoric, religious texts, and sometimes even basic mathematics. Yet, even for these privileged few, their education was often designed to make them more accomplished wives and mothers, not independent scholars or merchants. Public sphere of learning, the universities and philosophical schools, remained almost exclusively male. A woman, no matter how intelligent, would struggle to gain the kind of comprehensive legal or administrative knowledge that would allow her to effectively manage large estates or engage in complex commercial ventures without male assistance. Even in the nascent Islamic Caliphate, where the pursuit of knowledge was highly encouraged by religious texts, and women did, in some instances, participate in scholarly life, especially within the religious sphere, formal educational institutions for women were still very limited compared to those for men. While some women became renowned scholars or poets, these were often exceptions benefiting from privileged backgrounds or exceptional circumstances. For the vast majority of women, learning was confined to the home, focused on religious instruction and practical domestic skills. The ability to read and write meant access to information and to networks that were crucial for economic activity, beyond subsistence, farming, or household production. Without these skills, women were largely excluded from administrative roles, from the burgeoning world of written contracts and accounts, and from professions that required record-keeping or formal communication. The barrier of illiteracy was not merely an inconvenience, it was a fundamental obstacle to economic agency, ensuring that women remained on the periphery of the formal economy and dependent on men for almost all interactions that required written communication or advanced knowledge. Number 6. Segregated and limited occupations. Imagine a world where your career path is largely predetermined by your gender, where entire industries and professions are simply off-limits, regardless of your skill or ambition. In 680, societies across the globe had deeply ingrained gender roles that dictated acceptable occupations for women, severely limiting their economic opportunities and often confining them to low-status, low-paying, or unpaid domestic work. While women were vital to the economy, their contributions were often invisible, undervalued, or relegated to specific, traditionally feminine spheres. In agricultural societies, which constituted the vast majority of the world in 680, women were indispensable. They worked alongside men in the fields, planting, harvesting, and processing crops. They managed household gardens, tended to livestock, and processed food for storage. However, this labor was often unpaid, seen as part of their domestic duty within the family unit. Any surplus generated from their efforts was typically controlled and traded by the male head of the household. Beyond the fields, women were almost universally responsible for the production of clothing. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, and sewing garments were incredibly labor-intensive tasks performed almost exclusively by women, from peasant homes to aristocratic households. Yet, this essential work rarely translated into independent economic power. If women sold surplus cloth or yarn, it was usually a small-scale, localized transaction, often controlled by their husbands or fathers. They were producers, but not typically independent merchants on a large scale. Urban areas offered slightly more variety, but still within strict gender confines. Women might work as bakers, brewers, innkeepers, or market vendors, often assisting their husbands or running small family enterprises. However, these roles were frequently seen as extensions of their domestic responsibilities rather than independent professional careers. A woman operating an inn, for example, was usually doing so as the wife of the innkeeper managing the household and serving guests. If her husband died, she might continue the business, but she would still largely operate within the framework established by him and would be subject to male oversight from guilds or local authorities. Certain trades, particularly those requiring extensive apprenticeships, physical strength, or public negotiation, like blacksmithing, carpentry, masonry, or large-scale merchant shipping, were almost entirely male domains. Women were excluded from guilds, which were powerful economic associations that controlled access to trades, regulated quality, and often provided social support. This exclusion meant women could not gain specialized skills, achieve master status, or benefit from the collective power and protection that guilds offered their male members. In the Byzantine Empire, while some women might have worked in workshops producing luxury goods, or as entertainers, their roles were often restricted to specific, often supervised environments. Higher status professions, such as scribes, lawyers, doctors, or administrators, were virtually exclusively male. Even in early Islamic societies, where women were theoretically allowed to own businesses and engage in trade, the reality was often different. Cultural norms encouraged female seclusion, making it difficult for women to participate in public markets or travel for trade without compromising their honor or safety. While there are accounts of women merchants, particularly in the earlier period, these were often women of significant family wealth, or those who operated within specific, accepted spheres. The economic landscape of 680 AD was therefore deeply segregated. Women's work, though often crucial for survival, was largely unpaid, undervalued, or confined to roles that did not provide independent wealth, accumulation, social mobility, or decision-making power. This occupational segregation ensured that women remained economically dependent and prevented them from accessing the more lucrative, influential, and independent professions of the era. Number 5. Restrictions on public life and movement. Imagine your world being confined to the walls of your home or village, with limited opportunities to travel, engage in public discourse, or participate in the bustling marketplaces and forums where economic life truly unfolded. In 680, stringent social norms and sometimes legal requirements across various cultures severely restricted women's participation in public life and their freedom of movement. This wasn't merely about personal liberty. It had profound economic implications, as it hindered women's ability to engage in trade, access markets, network with others, or even seek independent legal redress. In many societies, especially those with stronger religious or patriarchal traditions, women were expected to remain largely within the domestic sphere. This was particularly true for women of higher social standing, where seclusion was often a mark of honor and status. A noblewoman in the Byzantine Empire, for instance, might live in luxury, but her public appearances would be carefully orchestrated and limited. She would not typically be found negotiating business deals in the forum or debating legal matters in public. Even if she owned property, its management would be delegated to male agents, as her direct involvement in the public sphere of commerce was deemed inappropriate. This meant she could not build direct relationships with suppliers, clients, or legal authorities, all of which are crucial for effective economic agency. In the rapidly expanding early Islamic Caliphate, the concept of modesty and female seclusion, or hijab in a broader sense, began to take stronger hold, particularly in urban environments. While early Islamic history does contain examples of women participating in public life and trade, the prevailing societal norms often encouraged women to remain indoors, or if they ventured out, to do so veiled and accompanied by a male guardian. For a woman to travel long distances for trade, to frequent bustling markets, or to attend public assemblies where economic decisions were made, was often seen as compromising her honor and defying societal expectations. This made it incredibly difficult for women to act as independent merchants, caravanners, or large-scale traders, roles that were essential for accumulating significant wealth in a world increasingly connected by trade routes. They could not personally oversee the transportation of goods, negotiate prices in distant markets, or establish new trade networks. Even in Western Europe, where outright veiling or strict seclusion was less common among the general populace, social expectations still limited women's public presence. A peasant woman would certainly move freely within her village and fields, but venturing to a distant market town or engaging in sustained travel for economic purposes was unusual and often unsafe without male escort. The public sphere, whether it was the local court, the urban market, or the religious gathering, was largely dominated by men. Women who did appear in public for economic reasons, such as selling produce from their gardens, often did so on a small scale and within the confines of accepted local roles. They were rarely the primary negotiators or the decision-makers in large economic transactions. The lack of freedom of movement and public presence meant that women were largely cut off from the dynamic economic opportunities that existed beyond the immediate confines of their homes and communities. They could not freely gather information, forge alliances, or participate in the broader economic networks that were forming across regions. This restriction on public life and movement effectively ghettoized women's economic activities, ensuring their continued dependence on male relatives for access to wider economic opportunities and resources. Number 4. Arranged marriages and the economic implications of dowry. Imagine your entire future, including your economic standing, being decided by your family based on alliances and wealth, rather than your own desires or aspiration. In 680, and across vast swaths of the world, marriage was less about individual choice and more about family alliances, property transfer, and social positioning. Arranged marriages were the norm, and the system of dowry or bride price played a crucial role, often defining a woman's economic fate in ways that limited her agency and made her an object of economic tractag rather than an independent economic actor. A dowry prevalent in places like the Byzantine Empire and parts of Western Europe was a transfer of property or money from the bride's family to the groom or his family upon marriage. While it was sometimes intended to provide for the wife's sustenance in the marriage, and sometimes to secure her position or an inheritance, its primary function was often to legitimize the marriage and to provide the husband's family with capital. The dowry was a significant economic burden for the bride's family, often consuming a large portion of their wealth. For the woman herself, once the dowry was transferred, its control typically passed to her husband. While legal provisions might exist for its return upon divorce or widowhood, claiming it back was often difficult and fraught with legal battles, especially for women without powerful male protectors. This meant that the dowry, instead of being an independent asset for the woman, became a part of her husband's economic domain, reducing her leverage and making her financially dependent on him. She did not control this significant asset that was ostensibly hers. Conversely, in some cultures, particularly in parts of Germanic Europe or in certain early Islamic traditions, A bride price or mahr was paid by the groom or his family to the bride or her family. While the mahr in Islamic law was legally the wife's property and could not be taken by the husband without her consent, cultural practices and male authority often meant that women's control over this wealth was limited in practice. In many societies, the bride price was effectively a compensation for the loss of a daughter's labor or a means for her family to acquire resources. For the woman, it meant she was literally bought into a new family. And while it might provide some security, it did not necessarily grant her economic independence. Her economic identity became tied to her new household, and her ability to act outside of it was severely curtailed. The arranged nature of these marriages further stripped women of economic agency. A woman had little to no say in who her husband would be, meaning she had no control over the economic circumstances of her future life. Her family might choose a husband who was wealthy but abusive, or one who was poor and left her in hardship, all for the sake of political alliances or financial gain for her family. Her personal desires, her aspirations, and her potential economic skills were secondary to the strategic calculations of her male relatives. This system also meant that women often transitioned directly from the economic control of their fathers to that of their husbands, with no period of independent economic activity. Their lives were a continuous state of being given over, their economic destinies charted by others. This pervasive system of arranged marriages and the economic transactions associated with fees and bride prices cemented women's economic dependence, making them independents of family alliances rather than independent economy actor. Their economic value was often assessed in terms of the assets they brought or the alliances they secured, rather than their inherent skills or potential for wealth creation. Number 3. Religious doctrines and societal norms. Imagine an entire society, including its laws and customs, being shaped by interpretations of sacred texts and ancient traditions that consistently place one gender in a position of authority over the other. In 680, of the major religions of the world, Christianity, Islam, and the Confucian philosophies of East Asia profoundly influenced societal norms and legal structures, often reinforcing and justifying the economic subordination. These doctrines were not merely abstract beliefs. They translated into daily practices, legal codes, and public expectations that severely limited women's economic agency. In Christianized Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire, interpretations of biblical texts often emphasized female submission and obedience to male authority. Passages that spoke of wives submitting to their husbands or women being silent in churches were used to justify limiting women's public roles and economic independence. The Church, as a major landowner and social institution, often propagated these views through its teachings and its own hierarchical structure, which excluded women from the priesthood and higher administrative roles. While convents offered some women a path to education and even significant administrative power, this was within a celibate, enclosed community, and not a pathway to independent economic agency in the secular world. For the vast majority of women, these religious doctrines reinforced the idea that their primary role was domestic, focused on childbearing and household management, rather than economic endeavors outside the home. Engaging in independent trade or acquiring land could be seen as stepping outside God-given roles, and societal pressure fueled by religious teaching could be immense. In the nascent Islamic Caliphate, while early Islamic law offered women more rights in property and inheritance than many contemporary systems, the pervasive societal norm of qawma, or male guardianship, and interpretations regarding modesty. While the Quran emphasizes the spiritual equality of men and women, verses regarding the roles of men as protectors and maintainers of women were often interpreted to mean male economic and social authority. This led to practices where women, even if they owned property, would often defer to male relatives for its management, or would find it socially unacceptable to participate actively in public markets or travel for trade. Concept of honor often became entwined with female seclusion, making it difficult for women to engage in public-facing economic roles without risking their family's reputation. While there were notable exceptions of powerful women and scholars, the general societal expectation, heavily influenced by religious interpretation, pushed women towards domesticity and away from independent public economic roles. In Tang Dynasty, China, Confucianism was the dominant philosophy, profoundly shaping social hierarchies and gender roles. Confucian ideals emphasized patriarchy, filial piety, and strict separation of male and female spheres. Women were expected to be subservient to their fathers, then their husbands, and finally their sons. Their primary virtue was seen in their domestic roles, raising children, and maintaining the household. Economic activity outside the home was discouraged, and women were largely excluded from education, official positions, and the formal economy. While women might manage household finances, their economic power was always within the confines of the family and under the ultimate authority of the male head. The societal pressure to conform to these gender roles was immense, enforced through family honor, social ostracism, and legal mechanisms. A woman who attempted to defy these norms and engage in independent economic ventures would face significant social disapproval and practical barriers. These pervasive religious doctrines and deeply ingrained societal norms created an ideological framework that justified and perpetuated the economic subordination of women. They shaped laws, limited opportunities, and ingrained a mindset that made it incredibly difficult for women to envision or pursue independent economic agency, effectively trapping them within a predefined, economically dependent role. Number 2. Lack of independent legal standing and recourse. Imagine being wronged, perhaps cheated, in a small transaction, or having your meager inheritance stolen and realizing you have no independent voice in the very system meant to deliver justice. In 680, a significant limitation on women's economic agency was their pervasive lack of independent legal standing and effective recourse within formal legal systems. Even if laws theoretically granted them certain rights, the practical ability to assert those rights, bring lawsuits, testify effectively, or even initiate a divorce was severely curtailed, often requiring male permission or representation. This meant that women were often at the mercy of male relatives or a patriarchal legal system, making it incredibly difficult for them to protect their economic interests or pursue justice when wronged. In many Western European societies, particularly among the Germanic kingdoms, women were often considered legally dependent. This meant they could not easily represent themselves in court. If a woman had a dispute over property, debt, or a contract, she would typically need a male guardian, a father, brother, or husband, to represent her. This guardian would speak on her behalf, manage the legal proceedings, and sometimes even make decisions that were not entirely in her best interest, but perhaps benefited the family or the male guardian himself. Without this male representation, a woman's case might not even be heard, or her testimony might be given less weight than a man's. This dependency meant that women were not truly equal before the law, making them vulnerable to economic exploitation. If a merchant defrauded a woman, her ability to seek justice was indirect and dependent on a male relative's willingness to act on her behalf. In the Byzantine Empire, while women had more codified rights than in the West, their ability to exercise these rights independently was still limited. For instance, while a woman could own property, selling it or initiating significant legal actions often required her husband's consent or intervention. Testifying in court was often permitted, but women's testimony might be viewed as less credible than men's in certain contexts, particularly if it involved matters of public importance or large sums of money. Furthermore, seeking a divorce, even in cases of abuse or economic neglect, was incredibly challenging for women. The legal process was complex, expensive, and often required proving fault on the part of the husband, which was difficult without independent means or powerful connections. A woman trapped in an economically disadvantageous or abusive marriage had few legal avenues to escape it and regain control over her life or assets. Even in early Islamic societies, despite legal advancements that granted women the right to contract own property and inherit the practical realities of male guardianship and social norms, often limited their independent legal standing. While a woman could technically initiate a divorce in certain circumstances, the process, known as khul, often required her to forfeit her mahr, or pay a compensation, making it economically punitive. Furthermore, seeking justice in court, especially in public disputes or those involving significant financial claims, was often easier for men. A woman might find it difficult to navigate the legal system without male assistance, and her testimony in certain legal contexts might be weighted differently. This lack of full independent legal standing meant that women were often unable to vigorously defend their economic interests, pursue business ventures without constant male oversight, or exit economically oppressive situations. Their economic agency was thus fundamentally compromised, as the very system meant to protect rights often required them to operate through male intermediaries, leaving them perpetually vulnerable and dependent. Number 1. The economic impact of childbearing and domestic labor. Imagine a life where your body is constantly in a cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery, where your days are filled with relentless unpaid labor that is essential for survival but provides no independent income or economic recognition. In 680, at the immense, often brutal economic impact of childbearing and domestic labor was perhaps the most universal and profound limitation on women's economic agency. This was not a legal barrier, but a biological and societal reality that consumed women's time, energy, and health, leaving little room for independent economic pursuits outside the home. Life expectancy was low, and infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. To ensure the survival of the family and lineage, women were expected to bear many children. This meant that most women spent a significant portion of their reproductive years either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or mesenching. Each pregnancy carried immense risks, and a woman could easily die in childbirth, as historical records grimly demonstrate. This constant cycle of childbearing was physically debilitating and severely limited a woman's ability to engage in sustained, physically demanding labor outside the home, or to travel for economic ventures. A woman with several young children would be perpetually tied to the home, nursing infants and caring for toddlers, making it impossible to participate in distant markets, engage in long-term apprenticeships, or manage a business that required constant public presence. Beyond childbearing, women were responsible for the vast, unseen labor that kept households functioning and economies afloat. This domestic labor was incredibly extensive and physically demanding, a far cry from modern conveniences. Women ground grain into flour, baked bread, processed meat, and vegetables for preservation, hauled water from wells or rivers, gathered firewood, and spun and wove all the clothing for the family from raw materials. They cleaned, cooked over open fires, cared for the sick and elderly, and managed the household economy, ensuring that resources were used efficiently. This labor, while absolutely essential for the survival of the family and the local economy, was universally unpaid and largely unrecognized as economic activity in the formal sense. It generated no direct income for the woman, no independent capital, and no status that could be leveraged in the public sphere. Consider a peasant woman in Anglo-Saxon England. Her day began before dawn and ended long after sunset. She might help in the fields, but her primary duties were in the home. She was the family's primary care, provider, food processor, clothing maker, and cleaner. This exhaustive work meant she had no spare time, no spare energy, and no means to accumulate wealth or participate in formal trade. Her economic contribution was vital, but it was absorbed into the family unit under the economic control of the male head of the household. She could not use her domestic skills to gain independent wealth or to leave an economically undesirable situation. Even for wealthier women, while they might supervise servants, The ultimate responsibility for household management and child-rearing was still hers. They were expected to oversee the production of food, clothing, and other necessities within their large households, which, while offering some managerial experience, was still a largely unpaid role that consumed their time and energy. This relentless demand for childbearing and domestic labor was a fundamental, inescapable barrier to women's economic agency in 680 AD. It anchored them to the private sphere, limited their mobility, consumed their physical and mental resources, and ensured that their profound economic contributions were never translated into independent wealth, power, or public recognition.